Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression by Robin O.G. Kelley. In memory of Hosea Hudson, griot of Alabama radicalism, whose assiduous note-taking and impeccable memory made this book possible, and for Deidre Harris Kelley, whose love, criticism, encouragement, and heroic tolerance for living in poverty made this book a reality. Preface. Ain't no foreign country in the world foreign as Alabama to a New Yorker. They know all about England, maybe France. Never met one who knew Bama. Anonymous Black Communist, 1945. After spending several years hobnobbing with European, Asian, and Soviet dignitaries of the Third International, Daily Worker correspondent Joseph North made a most unforgettable journey to, of all places, Chambers County, Alabama. Traveling surreptitiously with a black Birmingham communist as his escort, North reached his destination, the tumble-down shack of a sharecropper comrade, in the wee hours of the night. The dark figure who greeted the two men had read The Worker for years, solid and reliable. He was respected by his folk here, who regarded him as a man with answers. The sharecropper was an elder in the Zion AME church, who trusts God, but keeps his powder dry. Reads his Bible every night, can quote from the book of Daniel and the book of Job, and he's been studying the Stalin book on the nation question. Although North's visit took place in 1945, on the eve of the Alabama Party's collapse, the sharecropper comrade he describes above epitomized the complex, seemingly contradictory radical legacy the party left behind. Built from scratch by working people without a European-American left-wing tradition, the Alabama Communist Party was enveloped by the cultures and ideas of its constituency. Composed largely of poor blacks, most of whom were semi-illiterate and devoutly religious, the Alabama cadre also drew a small circle of white folks, whose ranks swelled or diminished over time, ranging from ex-Klansmen to former Wobblies, unemployed male industrial workers, to iconoclastic youth, restless housewives, to renegade liberals. These unlikely radicals, their milieu, and the movement they created make up the central subjects of this book. Heeding Victoria de Grazia's appeal to historians of the American left for a social history of politics, I have tried to construct a narrative that examines communist political opposition through the lenses of social and cultural history, paying particular attention to the worlds from which these radicals came, the worlds in which they lived, and the imaginary worlds they sought to build. I pluralize worlds to emphasize the myriad individual and collective differences within the Alabama communist movement. Those assembled under the red banner did not all share the same vision of radical opposition, nor were they motivated by the same circumstances. Neither the Jimmy or Jane Higginses of historian Aileen Creditor's mind, nor the doty, selfless caricatures of left-wing fiction. These women and men came from the farms, factories, mines, kitchens, and city streets, not as intellectual blank sheets, but loaded down with cultural and ideological baggage, molded by their race, class, gender, work, community, region, history, upbringing, and collective memory. Their ideas and concerns shaped the party's political practice and social life at the most local level, and, in turn, Alabama radicals were themselves shaped by local CP leaders' efforts to change the way ordinary people thought about politics, history, and society. What emerged was a malleable movement rooted in the variety of different pasts, reflecting a variety of different voices, and incorporating countless contradictory tendencies. The movement's very existence validates literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin's observations that a culture is not static, but open, capable of death and renewal, transcending itself, that is, exceeding its own boundaries. And Alabama communists had titanic boundaries to exceed. More than in the Northeast and Midwest, the regional incubators of American communism, race pervaded virtually every aspect of Southern society. The relations between industrial labor and capital, the landlords and tenants, were clouded by divisions based on skin color. On the surface, at least, it seemed that there existed two separate racial communities in the segregated South that only intersected in the world of work or at the marketplace. Sharp class distinctions endured within both black and white communities. But racism tended to veil and at times arrest intraracial class conflict, as well as interracial working class unity. Alabama party leaders could not escape the prevalence of race, despite their unambiguous emphasis on class-based politics. Indeed, during its first 5 years in Alabama, the CP inevitably evolved into a race organization, a working-class alternative to the NAACP. As Nell Painter observed, the rank-and-file folk made the party their own. In Alabama in the 1930s, the CP was a Southern, working-class, black organization. The homegrown radicalism that had germinated in poor black communities and among tiny circles of white rebels remained deep underground. Alabama communists did not have much choice. Their challenge to racism and to the status quo prompted a wave of repression one might think inconceivable in a democratic country. The extent and character of anti-radical repression in the South constitute a crucial part of our story. When we ponder Werner Sombart's question, why is there no socialism in the United States? In light of the South, violence and lawlessness loom large. The fact is, the CP and its auxiliaries in Alabama did have a considerable following, some of whom devoured Marxist literature and dreamed of a socialist world. But to be a communist, an ILD member, or an SCU militant was to face the possibility of imprisonment, beatings, kidnapping, and even death. And yet the party survived, and at times thrived, in its thoroughly racist, racially divided, and repressive social world. Indeed, most scholars have underestimated the Southern left and have underrated the role violence played in quashing radical movements. Religious fundamentalism, white racism, black ignorance, or indifference, the communists' presumed insensitivity to Southern culture, their advocacy of black self-determination during the early 1930s, and an overall lack of class consciousness are all oft-cited explanations for the party's failure to attract Southern workers. The experiences of Alabama communists, however, suggest the racial divisions were far more fluid and Southern working-class consciousness far more complex than most historians have realized. The African Americans who made up the Alabama radical movement experienced and opposed race and class oppression as a totality. The party and its various auxiliaries served as vehicles for black working-class opposition on a variety of different levels, ranging from anti-racist activities to intra-racial class conflict. Furthermore, the CP attracted some openly bigoted whites despite its militant anti-racist slogans. The party also drew women whose efforts to overcome gender-defined limitations proved more decisive to their radicalization than did either race or class issues. I suppose I should say something about the now infamous debate over the CPUSA's relationship to the Communist International, although it had to be brewing since the new social historians who sought to rewrite CP history from the bottom up challenged earlier studies by Theodore Draper and others depicting American communists as veritable puppets of the Kremlin intrigue. The controversy reached a climax in 1985 when battle lines were drawn between pro- and anti-Draper forces, and a deluge of letters and articles engulfed the New York Review of Books. As a 23-year-old graduate student about to embark on what would have been a multi-volume dissertation on the Communist Party in South Africa and the American South, I was eager to enter the fray. But as I was an unknown entity in the academic community, with only a book review to my credit, no respectable journal or newspaper would have taken me seriously. Nevertheless, my youth and my anonymity turned out to be a blessing in disguise. For after having spent the next 4 years living and breathing Alabama CP history, the whole debate seems, in retrospect, rather superfluous, even silly. Of course, the Alabama cadre dutifully followed national and international leadership, just as Birmingham NAACP leaders jumped at every directive handed down from their executive secretary, Walter White. Local communists cried out for direction. especially after wrestling with vague theoretical treatises on capital's crisis or on the growing specter of fascism. Though they knowingly bucked national leadership decisions on a few occasions, local cadre tried their best to apply the then current political line to the tasks at hand. But because neither Joe Stalin, Earl Browder, nor William Z. Foster spoke directly to them or to their daily problems, Alabama communists developed strategies and tactics in response to local circumstances that, in most cases, had nothing to do with international crises. Besides, if Alabamians had waited patiently for orders from Moscow, they might still be waiting today. Not only were lines of communication between New York and Birmingham hazy throughout the 1930s and 1940s, but Birmingham communists had enough difficulty maintaining contact with comrades as close as Tallapoosa County. The complex and decentralized structure of party organization in Alabama requires a nuanced and somewhat detailed narrative sensitive to local history. Hammer and Hoe examines party activity in the neighborhoods, industrial suburbs, company towns of greater Birmingham-Bessemer area, the Black Belt and its urban centers of Montgomery and Selma, and the eastern Piedmont counties. When possible, I have tried to chronicle CP work in Mobile as well as in several northern Alabama counties, but communists there did not have much of a public presence and left very few records. The organization of this book, therefore, reflects the party's multi-issue, multi-community focus. Following a brief portrait of Birmingham from its inception to the Great Depression, Part 1 reconstructs the period from 1930 to 1935 in 5 thematic chapters. Chapter 1 documents the party's origins and the early organizing efforts among Birmingham's jobless from 1930 to 1933. Turning to the countryside, Chapter 2 chronicles the sharecroppers' union's first 5 years and offers some insights into the context and character of rural radicalism. The party's industrial organizing efforts and the intensification of anti-radical repression during the 1934 strike wave are the focus of Chapter 3. The 4th chapter looks at the CP-led International Labor Defense's challenge to black middle-class leadership and examines the racial, class, and sexual dimensions of the ILD's involvement in alleged rape cases. The final chapter in Part 1 steps back from the narrative for a moment and explores the social, ideological, and cultural foundations of radicalism among black communists, the ways in which Marxist pedagogy influenced their outlook, and the party's role in shaping class conflict within the black community. Part 2, which deals with the Popular Front 1935 to 39, adopts a similar thematic format. Chapter 6, 1935 to 37, traces local leaders' response to and interpretation of the new policy, discusses communist efforts to build alliances with Southern liberals, and examines the effect of Popular Front politics on the party's rank and file. Chapters 7 through 9 analyze the communists' role in building both Congress of Industrial Organizations and the Workers' Alliance, and document the collapse of the Sharecroppers' Union. These 3 chapters, along with Chapter 6, explain the decline in Black Party membership during the Popular Front, the Birmingham CP's retreat from working-class militancy and entrance into the world of Southern liberalism, the period from 1937 to 1939, are the subjects of Chapter 10. Part 3, which covers the historical moment from the Nazi-Soviet pact to the U.S. entry into World War II, consists of a single chapter. Here we find the party on the road to revitalization, not as an autonomous organization, but as part of a much broader, radical interracial youth movement. Finally, the epilogue sweeps through the war and post-war periods, reconstructing the party's ultimate demise and ruminating on the legacy it left behind. In closing, I should add that some of the stories herein have been told before. 2 decades ago, an old black farmer named Ned Cobb shared his recollections of the communist-led Sharecroppers Union with Theodore and Dale Rosengarten. The result was the moving narrative All Gods' Dangers, published in 1974. Another participant, Griot Hosea Hudson, preserved the struggles of Birmingham communists in his heavily edited book Black Worker in the Deep South, 1972. A few years later, the richness and complexity of Hudson's life and the lives of his comrades were brilliantly captured by Nell Irvin Painter in the narrative of Hosea Hudson, His Life as a Negro Communist in the South, 1979. Two magnificent oral memoirs are a hell of an act to follow. No university-trained historian can match the beauty and grace of Cobb's and Hudson's storytelling, nor can she or he convey with all required subletities the feelings, the fears, the pride, the confusion, the mosaic of emotions that went with being black and radical in the Depression South. In order to truly appreciate the men and women who made the movement, I urge all to read Rosengarten's and Painter's wonderful narratives as companion volumes to this book. The saga of the Alabama Communist Party is but a chapter in a larger work waiting to be written. Communists were all over the South, from Chattanooga, Tennessee to Oxford, Mississippi, influencing communities and individuals in ways we have yet to understand, making history we have yet to know. Though they never seized state power or led a successful socialist revolution below the Mason-Dixon line, communists deserve a place in Southern history. As former Alabama Party leader Robert Fowler Hall argued a few years ago, if the courage of white liberals, though ineffective, is worth a book, the courage of Southern communists during these 3 decades justifies some footnotes, at the very least, some books. Atlanta and Chapel Hill, July 1989. Prologue, Radical Genesis, Birmingham, 1870 to 1930. It is an industrial monster sprung up in the midst of a slow-moving pastoral. It does not belong, and yet it is one of many proofs that Alabama is an amazing country, heterogeneous, grotesque, full of incredible contrasts. Birmingham is a new city in an old land. Carl Kramer. Perhaps more than any other city, Birmingham comes closest to embodying the mythic New South creed. Its resident absentee mine and mill owners turned a cornfield and a swamp into a multiracial, bustling, smoky bastion of industrial capitalism, where profits ruled and feudal values of the Old South echoed faintly in the background. Their wealth depended on a huge, disciplined, docile labor force, but unlike machines, working people and their advocates fought to alter conditions they considered unjust or intolerable. Thus, as a competing center of heavy industry, Birmingham was to the Deep South what Cripple Creek, Colorado, or Coeur d'Alene, Idaho was to the West, a cauldron of class conflict. But as Carl Kramer so eloquently explains above, the matrix of old and new makes Birmingham an unparalleled industrial center. The mine and mill owners hope to mold an industrial proletariat in a city founded less than a generation after the abolition of chattel slavery and peopled with 2 races afraid of each other. From the discovery and exploitation of large mineral deposits in central Alabama emerged the Birmingham Industrial Complex, a region often called the Pittsburgh of the South. Before 1879, the Pratt Coal and Coke Company mined and exported the rich deposits of iron ore, coal, and limestone to northern industries. When TCI took over the holdings of the Pratt Coal and Coke Company in 1886, which 5 years earlier had been purchased by industrialist Enoch Ensley, TCI became the most prodigious iron and steel manufacturer in the South. TCI swallowed up a large portion of the local iron and steel industry, and most remaining holdouts merged into 3 competing companies: the Sloss Sheffield Steel and Iron Company, the Woodward Iron Company, and the Republic Iron and Steel Company. The juxtaposition of limestone, coking coal, dolomite, and red hematite ore substantially reduced production costs, but it was not enough to make Birmingham's coal and iron industry competitive on the national market. Unlike the alluvial ore found in the Great Lakes region, Birmingham's deposits were buried deep below mountainous slopes, and region's insufficient water supply increased transportation costs, and the lower metallic content of the ore rendered capital investments comparatively higher. Yet, cheap black and white labor from Alabama countryside compensated for the capital-intensive nature of mining, making the Birmingham district one of the least costly industrial centers in the country. Although Birmingham's profits rarely measured up to expectations, and fortunes were earned and lost in an economy that resembled a slot machine, the district nevertheless generated tremendous wealth for a tiny minority. In 1910, individuals whose net worth was over $35,000 comprised merely 1% of the population, whereas 80% earned below $500 per annum. In addition to having the means for an elegant lifestyle, this small group of industrialists wielded enormous economic and political power. Interlocking directorships and control over various real estate, banking, and mining ventures were held by such individuals such as Henry T. de Barleden, Robert I. Ingalls, Erskine Ramsay, Robert Jemison Jr., Walter Henley, and others. Although few held political office, these men used financial strength to exercise considerable power over local government. Birmingham's nouveau riche industrialists spent lavishly and developed a strong consciousness of class and sense of social cohesion. They built plush mansions in areas such as Shades Valley and Mountain Brooks estates, distant from the bellowing smoke of the steel mills. In a spectacular display of wealth, one Birmingham capitalist built a home replicating a Roman temple. Alongside numerous bronze and plaster statues sat two dog houses, built like miniature Parthenons with classic porticos and tiny pillars. Below, in the Valley of Furnaces, was another world in the making. Thousands of landless farmers from the surrounding counties, particularly blacks, were rapidly drawn into the orbit of industrial production. By 1900, 55% of Alabama's coal miners and 65% of its iron and steel workers were black. Overall, African Americans made up more than 90% of Birmingham's unskilled labor force by 1910, thus constituting one of the largest black urban communities in the New South. As in any other New South urban community, race penetrated all aspects of the city's life. Segregation ordinances proliferated between 1900 and 1905, and Alabama's move to disenfranchise blacks reduced the state's black voters from 100,000 to a negligible 3,700 after 1901. Segregation in the public sphere reinforced the development of a separate black social and cultural world. Yet unlike northern urban centers such as New York or Chicago, where blacks were concentrated in one or two dense sections of the city, Birmingham's blacks resided in several segregated pockets situated along creek beds, railroad lines, and alleys near the downtown area. Black working-class neighborhoods throughout the first 3 decades of the 20th century suffered from the lack of streetlights, paved streets, sewers, and other city services. Birmingham was an unmistakably segregated city, but spatially there was no single identifiable black community to speak of. Excluding the greater Birmingham area and the surrounding industrial suburbs, the central core of black residents settled along the 20th Street axis from the southern section of the city towards the railroad tracks which ran through downtown. Not all blacks toiled in the mines, mills, kitchens, and streets of Birmingham. A tiny but influential black elite established a flourishing business district along 18th Street in the heart of downtown. As early as 1890, the Reverend W. R. Pettiford founded and presided over Birmingham's first black bank, the Alabama Penny Savings and Loan, and black residents often boasted of their millionaire inventor, Andrew J. Beard, or the affluent funeral director and insurance magnate, C. M. Harris. Black businessmen and religious leaders made their fortune from a consumer base of working-class blacks, ensured peaceful relations by creating alliances with white industrialists, and a handful secured enough respectability to retain the franchise. Like the white elite, they maintained their own exclusive social clubs and rarely interacted with poor blacks. While the Negro Federation of Women's Clubs and allied organizations occasionally focused on social welfare issues, Black Birmingham's numerous religious and literary societies occupied a great deal of the black middle-class women's time. The black elite could not always find complete satisfaction in material wealth when they, too, were denied basic democratic rights. Some black middle-class spokesmen searched for autonomous alternatives to Jim Crow within and without the region. African colonization and other immigration schemes were proposed by blacks and white liberals during the late 19th century, and in Oxford, Alabama, in 1899, a group of leading black citizens established one of the nation's first all-black towns. In virtually every case of black political assertion, however, the white status quo only recognized as spokespersons for the African American community the black elite, whether followers of the accommodationist teachings of Booker T. Washington or the Back to Africa movement of Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, and rarely was the black elite's self-appointed leadership challenged by the masses of blacks. The newly created industrial complex also attracted significant numbers of immigrants from northern mining communities or directly from Europe. By 1890, first and second generation immigrants, particularly Italians, Scots, Germans, and Britons, comprised nearly one-fourth of Birmingham's white population, a substantial number for the urban South. More striking is the fact that in 1910, one-half of the coal, iron, and steel workers were immigrants, many of whom had been skilled colliers and metal workers before moving to the South. As Southern whites left the farm to take advantage of Birmingham's employment opportunities, the percentage of immigrants in the labor force declined precipitously. Although thousands of white immigrants found their way into the cotton mills and lumber yards in other parts of the state, a large portion joined black workers and immigrants in the mines and steel factories. During the first 3 decades of the 20th century, thousands of Southern women also left the farm and found work in the greater Birmingham area or simply labored as unpaid workers in the households of their husbands who toiled in the mines and mills. The proletarianization of white females drawn to the state's rapidly growing textile industry hardly affected Birmingham. The textile factories there employed only 283 women in 1930. The city's 8,038 white working women were scattered in dozens of occupations, mainly clerical and professional pursuits. Although limited wartime industrialization led to an increase in white female wage labor, by 1930 most white women worked as housewives. In fact, despite numerical increases, the percentage of women wage earners in the state decreased from 40.9% in 1910 to 25.5% in 1930. And this figure mainly indicates the status of white women, of whom 85% were reportedly housewives in 1930. In 1920, black women comprised 60% of the city's 20,082 female workers, and of that number, 87% were engaged in domestic work. Thousands of women and men who streamed into Birmingham searching for opportunities made up the cheap labor force from which local capitalists could make their fortunes. Yet the city's young proletariat was by no means docile. On the contrary, many had had some organizing experience. 2 decades prior to the populist upheaval of the 1890s, James T. Rapier, black leader of the Labor Union of Alabama, an affiliate of the newly formed National Labor Union, attempted to organize black industrial and agricultural workers throughout the state. More significantly, the Knights of Labor and the Greenback Labor Party established a tradition of militant interracial unionism among Birmingham coal miners. Blacks comprised the majority of Greenback labor supporters in the Birmingham district before the party dissolved in 1880. Working among black and white coal miners and lumber workers throughout Alabama, the Knights proved quite effective, establishing a number of local assemblies in Jefferson County. While Knights led several small strikes in Alabama's coal fields between 1882 and 1885, the organization on a national level began to decline after 1886, partly because of the anti-labor hysteria following the Haymarket Affair, the emergence of the AFL, and the leadership's decision to adopt a no-strike pledge. The AMW, a local movement distinct from the AMWA, founded by ex-Knights and rural migrants who brought agrarian radicalism to the mines and mills, continued organizing Birmingham workers until it was crushed during the coal miners' strike of 1894. Late in the decade, however, national leadership in the AMWA reinvigorated organized labor in Alabama's coal mines and began a campaign to rebuild the Union. All three organizations left a remarkable record of labor activity, of 603 strikes initiated by Alabama's workers between 1881 and 1936. 303 took place during 1881 and 1905. But as the 20th century approached, white workers began to drift away from the UMWA. During both the 1904 and 1908 coal miners' strikes, black workers were in the majority. Taking advantage of the large black presence in the UMWA, employers adeptly used racist propaganda, violence, and black convict labor to weaken unionism in Alabama's coal fields. In the aftermath of the 1908 strike, TCI executive George Gordon Crawford adopted the paternalistic methods of the parent company, United States Steel, as a bulwark against unionism and to create a more stable labor force. Because of poor working conditions, dilapidated housing, overburdened public facilities, and polluted water supplies, the turnover rate for Birmingham labor hovered around 400%. Crawford sought to turn the situation around by establishing workers' villages with decent, well-constructed homes, playgrounds, schools, churches, and health facilities for employees. These segregated company-owned settlements were laid out in Greater Birmingham's industrial suburbs, especially northern Birmingham, Woodlawn, Ensley, Greenwood, Collegeville, Smithfield, and Fairfield. The city of Bessemer established a similar residential pattern in which miners and some steel workers lived in company-owned double-tenant shotgun houses. By 1920, over 17,000 workers lived in homes maintained by various industrial concerns and ranging in quality from well-constructed wood-frame houses to shoddy dwellings of board and battered construction. Although conditions improved in many company communities and the turnover rate dropped significantly to 5.1% in 1930, TCI exercised greater control over workers' lives. The UMWA in Alabama was temporarily crushed after World War I, more the result of state violence and race baiting than TCI's paternalistic policies. Disaster followed when Birmingham coal miners, 3/4 of whom are black, struck for higher wages in 1919 and again in 1920. Backed by state troops dispatched by Governor Thomas Kelley, TCI crushed the strike as well as the UMWA in Alabama. The union's collapse marked the end of biracial unionism in Alabama until the 1930s. Iron ore miners and iron and steel workers did not establish the same tradition of interracial unionism during this period. The Metal Trades Council of Birmingham concentrated its efforts exclusively on skilled workers, ignoring black workers who comprised nearly 1/2 of steel and iron workers and 70% of the ore miners. Given the unwritten racial quota on occupational mobility and the slowness of technological change in the iron and steel industry, black workers remained unskilled and therefore unorganized. In the iron ore mines, mass industrial organizing efforts were not only met with force and violence, but company officials used racist propaganda to keep black and white workers divided. Attempted strikes in 1918 and 1919 left the NASA industrial organizing campaign in shambles, and hundreds of dedicated union men, black and white, were blacklisted during the years that followed. The swelling ranks of women workers remained largely unorganized, and middle-class women's reform movements barely took notice of female toilers, particularly black women. Black domestic laborers, the majority of the female workforce, were considered unrecognizable and unimportant, and thus were virtually invisible in the eyes of the white male labor organizers. White middle-class women initiated a vibrant reform movement around women's suffrage, the YWCA movement, labor reform, and opposition to convict labor. But middle-class reformers excluded poor white women and often, especially in the case of women's suffrage, exhibited hostilities towards their darker sisters. In the end, a dynamic women's interracial movement did not spring up in Birmingham as it had in areas such as Atlanta and Memphis. With the death of the Knights of Labor, working-class radicalism had few organized outlets. The Socialist Party was visibly active in the state around the turn of the century, claiming 400 members in 1908. The Socialists eventually attracted a small following among poor white farmers in Baldwin, Bibb, Covington, and Coleman counties, and among a landful of Birmingham skilled workers. It reached its peak in electoral strength in 1912 when Alabamians cast 3,029 votes, 2.6% of the state's electorate, for Eugene Debs. In Birmingham, the only socialist who held office was Arlie K. Barber, a staunchly anti-corporate suburban druggist elected to the city commission in 1915. Unlike Louisiana and parts of Texas, where Southern socialists organized blacks, albeit in separate locales, in Alabama, the SPA was a strictly white man's party. In 1905, Montgomery socialist E.F. Andrews maintained that organizing blacks, especially on an integrated basis, would have disastrous results. Northern socialists did not understand, he explained in 1905, that white Southerners were surrounded by some 8 millions of more or less civilized people belonging to a race in a stage of evolution so far removed from our own that for aught we can see at present, assimilation must be impossible for an indefinite period. Like many other Southern socialists, Andrews believed the time was ripe for propagandizing the socialist cause, but feared organizing blacks would lead to charges of fostering social equality. The decade after World War I was marked by unsettling social and economic transformations affecting all strata of Birmingham society. Following 2 decades of mercurial growth, conservative values clashed with the course of industrialization. Xenophobia, racism, and rigid moralism informed mainstream politics in Birmingham during the 1920s, lasting well into the 1930s. White supremacist groups organized by some of the city's leading citizens hoped to establish order and a degree of cultural homogenization through intimidation and violence. The Ku Klux Klan, in particular, enjoyed huge numerical and financial support during the 1920s, emerging as one of the city's most powerful political forces. Klansmen sought to cleanse their city of Jews, Catholics, labor agitators, and recalcitrant African Americans who have refused to accept their place in the hierarchy of race. A large number of poor whites were also drawn to this essentially middle-class Protestant movement, but their participation did not improve the squalid poverty that many were forced to endure long before the stock market crash of 1929. Organized labor did not completely buy into the reactionary tendencies of Southern Jazz Age politics. Although industrial unionism lay prostrate, craft unions successfully fought for municipal reforms and sustained a dynamic involvement in local politics after World War I. Robert La Follette's Farm Labor Party, for instance, received nearly 12% of the votes in Jefferson County. The Labor Advocate Journal of Birmingham Trades Council sustained somewhat of an urban populist tradition. It not only fought raising rents in working-class neighborhoods, but supported the single tax movement and called for municipal ownership of public utilities. A.H. Cather's eclectic Southern Labor Review, though not an official publication of the Birmingham labor movement, combined both radical and conservative tendencies. Cather outrightly attacked capitalism, called for unity of farmers and workers, advocated cooperationism under Christian principles, yet was among the most avid supporters of the temperance movement. Nonetheless, it is difficult to assess the impact of the labor press during the 1920s, when all that remained of the labor movement after 1922 was fragmented craft unionism. Nativism, racism, and the violence which accompanied these attitudes served as an effective bulwark against the resurgence of an already emancipated labor movement. The war and post-war period altered Black lives fundamentally. Northern employment opportunities and Southern injustice compelled a substantial portion of Southern Blacks to make their way north, although several thousand rural migrants first tested the urban South. Because the expansion of Birmingham's industrial complex also grew vast numbers of Black people from rural Alabama and Georgia into the steel and mine iron mills, the influx into the already overcrowded and highly segregated metropolis led to a deterioration of living conditions. Moreover, the country's failure to fulfill wartime promises of equality and the renewed militancy of returning war veterans left race relations in Birmingham unusually tense. Compounded by the struggles of Black miners during the violent strikes of 1919 and 1920-21, post-war Birmingham could have erupted much like Chicago. Indeed, authorities anticipated riots in the Magic City. Nevertheless, the ways in which post-war Black radicalism manifested itself in most of the country were not duplicated in Alabama. Besides emigration schemes that had no apparent connection with the UNIA, Garveyism had few organized followers among Black Alabamians. In 1922, a small group of UNIA adherents lived in Neenah and Camden, Alabama, and a handful of North Birmingham residents read the Garveyite tabloid, The Negro World, and contributed funds to the UNIA nationally, but there is no evidence that an active chapter ever existed in Birmingham. By 1923, the UNIA had established divisions in Mobile and neighboring Pritchard, Alabama, but these chapters were quite small. In 1926, the Pritchard Division, Alabama's largest UNI division, reported only 11 dues-paying members. Responding to racial tensions and rising expectations, branches of the NAACP were established in several Alabama cities, including Birmingham, Selma, Uniontown, Blockton, Anniston, Tuscaloosa, and Montgomery. These branches, established by Black middle-class leaders, intended to redirect Black resistance towards more respectable avenues. The Birmingham branch, for instance, grew directly out of the Colored Citizens League of Bessemer, an organization of ministers and businessmen founded in 1916. In 1919, the League created a committee on race relations in order to quell potential violence, and out of this post-war committee emerged the Birmingham branch of the NAACP. The NAACP in Alabama could not sustain the immediate post-war enthusiasm for Black organization. Although the Birmingham chapter claimed nearly 1,000 members in 1919, in less than 3 years its membership dropped to a dismal 36, and in 1923 it reported only 14 dues-paying members. 5 years later, the branch ceased operations altogether. Similarly, the Montgomery branch, founded in 1918, ballooned to 600 in 1919, only to dwindle to a paltry 43 dues-paying members a year later. Ku Klux Klan intimidation and other forms of repression partly explain the rapid demise of the NAACP during the 1920s, but racial violence notwithstanding, the association's local leadership ignored the problems Black working people faced daily. The Birmingham branch's agenda focused more on the city's Black business interests than on racial violence, the denial of civil liberties, and the immediate problems confronting the poor. The Black middle class's silence was broken briefly in 1926, however, by a Black Birmingham schoolteacher named Indiana Little. 6 years after white women won the right to vote, Little led a predominantly female crowd of 1,000 to the steps of Jefferson County Courthouse and demanded an immediate end to Black disenfranchisement. City officials refused to hear her arguments and arrested her for vagrancy. In the final analysis, white middle-class reformism was more concerned with working people's moral behavior than their economic well-being, and Black middle-class reformism, with its mild pleas for a junior partnership in democracy, was crushed to earth. Shorn of effective organization, workers approached a new decade on the threshold of economic disaster. The urban South began to feel the effects of the Great Depression as early as 1927, 2 years before the stock market crash. The Birmingham Trades Council reported an unemployment rate of 18% in February 1928, and between 1926 and 1929, the Jefferson County Red Cross's relief rolls more than doubled. Huge numbers of Black and white workers were laid off in 1929 when TCI shut down 2 blast furnaces in Bessemer. A year later, coal production had reached its lowest level since 1921. Pig iron output had dropped by over 41%, and to exacerbate an already desperate situation, Jefferson County experienced a surge of migrants hoping to escape rural poverty. And although poor Blacks, particularly recent arrivals from the rural areas, had suffered steady economic deterioration since the post-war recession, whites suddenly found themselves faced with similar circumstances. Most striking is the fact that the percentage of white workers on the country's relief rolls jumped from 14.5% in 1926 to 32.5% in 1930. By 1930, Black and white working people had very little in the way of organizational power, and in the shadow of a decade of Klan violence and racist backlash within the labor movement, the prospects of interracial unity seemed unrealizable. As the effects of the Depression began to take their toll, workers, particularly Blacks, had few weapons against plant shutdowns and massive layoffs.